There's this strong correlation between performance and learning agility, even more so than other factors that are out there when we think about things like IQ or structured interviews, EQ, or what we would call emotional intelligence, as well as on-the-job experience.
Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Alisha O'Neill, co-founder, director, and visionary of Phoenix Rising Consulting Group. As a certified coach in learning agility, she guides senior leadership teams through transformational change, facilitates team effectiveness, leads talent development, and coaches individuals to realize their full potential. With over 2 decades of experience in organizational transformation and integrating programs across various business areas, I'm excited to have her share her insights with you. Well, welcome, Alisha. Can you share with us a story that has shaped the trajectory of your career, whether it's that was a really good learning or a success story?
Yeah, for sure. No, thanks for asking and thanks for having me here. It's very exciting. It's been an interesting journey, I would say, in terms of my career. I would say I'm on my 3rd career at this point. I had a big background in sales and marketing, and so kind of pursued that for a while, and then shifted into HR for probably about 15 years. And now I would consider myself an entrepreneur and a business owner at this point, taking those learnings from those different experiences and now applying them in terms of the business itself. So yeah, it's been great to learn from that, and I think it just shows how much you can incorporate those transferable skills in other ways.
I love that for you because no experience is essentially wasted. Every is a learning opportunity that gives you leverage for that next thing, right? And on the Leader Within, the biggest thing is I'm curious as to what leaders have been able to do to empower their leader within. So given your experience, what has been your biggest leadership epiphany to date?
That is an interesting question. One of the areas of focus that I'm really spending some time on is around learning agility. And so I think that's probably been a big epiphany for me. It's been an area that I've been studying for probably the last 18 months now. I completed my applied project through my MBA program on that. And it's just kind of continued from there. I've become a certified coach in learning agility now, and it's probably a big passion area for me. So I think it's a topic that I think more people should be talking about and understanding in terms of how to develop their potential and their performance overall. So I think that's probably been, major focus area over the next little while here.
Okay, I want to dive into that learning agility piece with you because as you were describing in our last catch up, what you've been up to and why, I was really excited because I'm with the future of work and some of the challenges that both individuals and leaders are going to face as they navigate the rapid evolution of technology and everything. Individuals are going to have way more careers in one lifetime that they might have maybe had in the past compared to that. So curious as to how you could break down what learning agility is for those who have never heard of this concept.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say that it's still kind of a newer concept, although it's actually been around for probably 25 years now. But learning agility is really your ability and your willingness to learn from experience. And then you take the knowledge and the feedback that you gain from that experience and you apply it to new and challenging situations. So that's how we would describe learning agility, but sometimes it's easier if we break it down into an analogy. And so if we think about, say, a soccer team and they're going through their post-match analysis, they're probably looking at the game footage, they're observing their performance in it, maybe their team's performance through that too. And they're thinking through strategies on how they can incorporate those learnings in order to be successful for future matches. And so much like a soccer team, if you have somebody who has high learning agility, they're really examining those experiences. They're seeking reasonable feedback from others, whether that's from a coach or say other teammates, and they're incorporating those insights into how they would approach new and challenging situations. So that's how we would describe learning agility.
Appreciate that. And I would love to kind of hear from you as to why should this matter to people? Because I notice that sometimes people might reflect on this when either they're going through major events like layoffs or restructurings, or maybe they have a midlife crisis, right? It's really major building blocks, but why should people care about this before those major events happen?
Yeah, there's a lot of studies out there that actually show a strong correlation between learning agility and performance and potential of individuals. And so that's why I think people should care about it. A couple of the studies that I'll touch on, there was a study that was conducted in 2019 by Kenneth Demise, and it was a meta-analysis. And so he looked at 20 empirically tested field studies that comprised of about 4,900 participants. It was just under that. And so through that research, what he found was that there's this strong correlation between performance and learning agility, even more so than other factors that are out there when we think about things like IQ or structured interviews, EQ, or what we would call emotional intelligence, as well as on the job experience. And then there was another study that was conducted by Drays and her colleagues. And that was an interesting one too, where her and her colleagues were able to identify the connection between learning agility and potential within the organization. And so potential is really your ability to move up or within an organization. And so their research found that if you're generally a high performer, you're probably 3 times more likely to be seen as a high potential. Now, that may not come necessarily as a surprise, but what was interesting about that particular study is when you had higher levels of learning agility, the individual was deemed to have as much as 18 times more potential within an organization. And that's massive. And that's probably something that people aren't talking about or maybe understanding. And so certainly as an individual or for leaders, I think that's really important for organizations and HR departments as they're thinking about their talent management practices. These are important studies to consider in that analysis.
Without doing a formal assessment, because I know usually that's actually really important, if individuals are like, you know what, like I'm curious as to where I'm sitting right now, right? So that I can start kind of flexing that muscle. What piece of advice would you offer them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll touch on maybe the assessment because I think that can be really helpful, as a certified learning agility coach in the LPd&x 7 assessment, which is a scientifically developed and globally recognized tool. It's really useful to understand your learning agility facets within that. And so there's actually 7 within it, and then you understand your overall learning agility score. So that can be very interesting for individuals to understand maybe their behavioral tendencies in situations or where they might have potential blind spots and things like that. And that's where I can really help as a coach to kind of interpret those results with them and guide them through that process. But let's say they didn't go through an assessment and they're just trying to figure out, where can I start as maybe a square one? And probably the biggest piece of advice I would have, and probably the simplest piece, would be self-reflection. It's such an important skill that people really should be incorporating into their daily routines. And, I often hear where people don't necessarily want to do it, or they feel they don't have time for it, but it really shows a strong correlation with learning agility as well as other factors. So there was actually an interesting study done a few years ago by a team of researchers, and Jennifer Porter summarized the research from that. But anyways, in this particular situation, the researchers had incorporated 15 minutes of self-reflection with the team. And so generally the team members would do this on their way home. So say they're on transit and they're thinking about their day and reflecting on their day. And what they found is that there was a 23% increase in team performance over 10 days. That's significant and such an easy thing to incorporate that we can do as individuals or as team members and so on. And so often when I'm coaching people on learning agility, one of the practical strategies is just incorporating some of those self-reflection questions. What went well today? What didn't go as well today? How did people feel when I interacted with them? Is there anything that I would have done differently? And so incorporating that can be really positive and practical ways that you can start increasing your learning agility today. And it increases in other factors too, your emotional intelligence and being open to diverse perspectives, etc.
Okay, I'm going to double click into that one, especially when you said reflecting as a team. And I know that sometimes individuals are not totally aware of where maybe that gap is or opportunity is, depending on how your organization likes to frame that. So for leaders who are facilitating these conversations, how do they have meaningful conversations so that those who have maybe lower awareness on topics like this can actually still get some meaningful output from that?
For sure. I will touch on that through that LPd&x 7 assessment that I was explaining earlier. There is actually an organizational report that's available too. So that can be kind of neat too, because you actually see the collective learning agility scores within a team. And that can be useful in terms of, what goals do we need to focus on as a team if we want to increase our learning agility. And that can also be kind of fun in terms of team building and team stand-up, but can be used in other ways for other talent management practices practices like succession planning, recruitment, or, say cultural integration projects. Let's say you got a merger and an acquisition going on and you're trying to bring two cultures together. That can be really useful. But if we put the report aside and, a leader is just trying to start building learning agility on their own and not necessarily using that report, I think one of the biggest ways that they can really influence things is creating a safe space for people to take calculated risks and experiment within that. Okay, and as employees go through that, they will absolutely have successes and they will have setbacks that occur. And through the coaching and feedback that leaders provide through that process, they can really help their employees build confidence. And so they can normalize setbacks and, have a different conversation, a different tone of that conversation. So rather than coming down hard on somebody, they can have a conversation as to what did you learn from that experience? What might you do differently if that experience presented itself again? Or what might you do in a different situation, understanding that knowledge? So that can be a great practical strategy that leaders can incorporate.
Appreciate that. And speaking of the learnings piece, what would you say is one of the biggest gaps that you're noticing in this space right now that potentially leaders or organizations are encountering?
Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest barriers that leaders and organizations are facing today is resistance to change. And that's a very normal behavior from employees. And the reason why is that our brains are wired that way. Okay, so we have these naturally ingrained behaviors that make it very difficult to transition from a traditional way of working to ways where we would incorporate more of those learning agility behaviors. And so that comes down to the threat and reward responses that we have in the brain. And so those threats can be perceived as things like fear of failure or loss of control, or maybe this is a situation that I'm unfamiliar with, and so I'm feeling uncomfortable. It's an ambiguous situation. And so when those threat responses start to increase, that's where we see that resistance to change.
Speaking of that threat in terms of resistance to change and everything, I'm curious, what is the role of learning agility in that? And for individuals who maybe are a lot more risk aversive, how do they even manage that during times of change?
Yeah. So I think one thing we need to keep in mind with learning agility is it's not about necessarily being smart or picking up things up quickly. It's a broad set of skills that people build that apply to these real world situations. So it's just as much about how you learn from the experience and what knowledge you gained within that experience. And so when we think about that resistance to change in that particular situation, and the organization's trying to figure out, how do we break through that and how do we build that learning agility? Well, when they can foster and actually model those types of behaviors, it helps teams and individuals be able to kind of navigate those changes and overcome some of those threat responses that we were talking about earlier, like that fear of failure or that loss of control or, heading into an uncertain situation. And so what happens is when you have individuals that have that high level of learning agility, the narrative shifts in their mind where they see change as an opportunity versus a threat. And what's really interesting is from an organizational culture perspective is when employees see their leaders and their teammates actually exhibit these behaviors, these learning agility behaviors, they start to embrace change and they start to feel more confident in it. So it creates this snowball effect that can happen within the organization. And so those are ways that you can overcome some of that resistance to change.
Okay, and you know how they say culture takes a very long time to change, right? So when it comes to a new leader stepping into a team, noticing that, threat responses are really high, I'm curious if you'd say is trust the first thing or is learning agility the first thing, or how would you even begin to advise on this? Because it seems like it would go hand in hand, right?
I do think they probably go hand in hand, right? When we talk about learning agility, as I mentioned, there's different facets within that. And so being able to manage some of those facets, like interpersonal communication, how you interact with others, or your self-awareness within a situation, etc. These all contribute to ways that you operate with others. And, if you're building more of those inroads with and being able to trust each other and stuff, that's where that can start to come up. So that's probably how I would respond to that one.
Okay, in terms of future-proofing yourself, because I know you had that marketing background before you head into HR, and then now you're adding this tool set on top of everything that you've gained. Curious as to how individuals can even begin to market whatever findings they have. Let's just say they come to you, they're like, I discovered that I have XYZ How do they then translate that into actually helping them and their career?
Yeah, for sure. And it's probably easier if I reference back to the assessment that I actually use within my work and with the clients. So really the output of that report is, a result, a kind of dashboard, I guess, that shows how you scored along these 7 learning agility facets and then that overall learning agility score. And so when I'm sitting down with a client or an individual and we're looking at the overall results, it's not necessarily that we're diving into every single one, but we're really focusing in on the areas that are going to match well with what they need to achieve in their career or their goals kind of moving forward, right? So they are very different conversations. This particular learning agility facet might be very important to this individual versus another individual that needs to focus on another area. And so as we're having the coaching session and having a conversation in that space, talking about those behavioral tendencies, we can really apply that in practical ways. Like, what are some strategies that they can either continue doing, maybe they need to stop doing, or they need to start doing. So those are some ways that we can kind of navigate through it. But I think what a lot of my clients get value out of when we're having the conversation is being aware of those potential blind spots and those derailers that can come up, because sometimes they're not even aware of it. And so having an objective report like that can be really helpful in making them aware of that, because they may have not even been aware in the first place. So, and then as we're going through that coaching session, what we do is we actually collaborate and we partner together on developing a plan for them. So it could be a career and development plan to help them focus in on certain areas and then maybe reduce in other areas.
Okay, I know I was like trying to steer away a little bit from assessments because I was like, I know it can get super technical and that's why I don't want to confuse people. But now I'm actually curious, like, what are the 7 facets of the assessment that you administer?
Yeah, there's interpersonal acumen, cognitive perspective, environmental mindfulness, which is really about your situational awareness, like really understanding what's going on around you. There's drive to excel. There's self-insight, which is really about your self-awareness. And then there's change alacrity. And so that's all about your eagerness for change and your willingness for change. And then the last one is feedback responsiveness, which is such an important one, right? I don't think a lot of people obtain enough feedback. And so within those 7 learning agility facets, that's what's comprised within your overall learning agility score. But what's interesting about the report is that you can see how you score on each of those 7 and then understand how that comes together in the overall picture.
I love that you bring the so what from these different facets, right? Because I think sometimes individuals will take an assessment and then they'll read the report and they're like, okay, now what do I do? But then you come into the picture and you're like, okay, like what are your business priorities or whatever, and maybe what are your individual goals and priorities? And then let's take that information and translate it moving forward. Right?
Exactly. That's exactly how it goes, because I want to make sure it's a meaningful conversation for them and that they're getting what they need out of it, right? The results are certainly helpful, but they help kind of paint that picture and what might be going on elsewhere in their life, either their professional life or their personal life. And so it's a great way that you can get that objective data and then create a plan around it as to what you're going to action moving forward to increase your performance and increase your potential overall.
Okay, so now that organizations have an idea of the impact that having those results and having your help could make on their organization, what needs to be in place before they're potentially ready for your help? Is it, like you said, a major event like a merger and acquisition, or is it just a lot of shifts happening in the organization? Again, what needs to be in place for them to be like, okay, we're ready for Alisha?
Yeah, I mean, I think the great news is that you can engage at any time. You don't need to necessarily wait for a big event before you're starting to think about learning agility. And what's nice about learning agility is that there's really simple practical strategies that you can incorporate, whether yourself as an individual or a leader, or on a broader scale within an organization or talent management system. So there's things that you can start today. And then the beauty of that is as you build that learning agility skill set within yourself and within the organization, when you have those big events come up, like say a major technology change, or there's a merger, an acquisition, or whatever else might be, you're actually more prepared at that point because you're feeling more confident in yourself. You're comfortable with the change that might come at you or how to stay calm under pressure. So that's how I would respond to that.
One of the questions that come to mind is some organizations are starting to flatten out a little bit where they're cutting more middle management related positions. And I can see this being such an invaluable tool for leaders who now have to absorb maybe double the size of the team or whatever it may be, right? So they can then equip their team. So can you give us a high level overview of what the impact of learning agility and just having maybe like a resource like yourself could be, especially for organizations who are going through that exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. So say, for example, you have an organization that is flattening their organization and their structures. They're thinking through like, how can we do this in an objective manner? And so that's where you could use a learning agility assessment like the Talent X7 assessment to help guide part of that conversation and make some objective decisions on things. When you look at the organizational reports, you actually get a full view to learning agility across the organization. And so if that's a skill set that the organization values and wants to encourage within it, say they want more of that innovation, that continuous learning, that adaptability, then you can actually start making some talent decisions based on what that comes out to be. So that's one consideration. The other thing I should point out too, because this might come up as a question, is just, do all roles need to be learning agile? Do they need to have that high level learning agility? And I would say no. Not every role in the organization necessarily needs to have those high learning agile folks within them. I think about safety sensitive positions, right, where you need more of that structure and that consistency in place to ensure that people get home safely at the end of the day, right? So you don't necessarily need high learning agility within those particular roles. But in situations where you are trying to increase that innovation or that adaptability and that growth, it's important to have that skill set. And I think one of the challenges that organizations face is that their structures and cultures can be very focused on things like tools and processes, which you absolutely need, but they sometimes miss the point on being able to exhibit some of these learning agility behaviors. And so if you have leaders and teammates that aren't adopting those behaviors or modeling those behaviors, it can be really challenging for teams and individuals to also incorporate those behaviors in their own ways of working. And that can have ripple effects too when you think about things like your business goals and the results that you're trying to achieve or leading through a particular change, etc.
I really appreciate that call out that it's not every single organization, right? Because as you know, even within HR, a lot of it is, well, it depends, right? As we slowly wrap up, one of my questions to you is, what do you think it takes to unleash the potential of individuals and organizations?
I mean, again, my passion point is on learning agility. So I do feel strongly that this is maybe a best kept secret within the scope of HR. And so I think if organizations, teams, HR departments, leaders, et cetera, can really incorporate that learning agility skill set, I think that they will see the benefits that come from that in terms of team engagement, team learnings, their adaptability, and subsequently their business results.
And you know what? You're actually the first individual out of the 60-something guests that I've had who actually has a deep knowledge within the learning agility space. And then out of all the individuals that I've connected over the last couple of years, again, you're the first individual who is focusing on this. So when you were telling me about the work that you're doing, I'm like, I gotta have you share your insights.
Well, I'm so glad to be here and support, and certainly if your viewers have questions, I'm just a email away.
Appreciate that. Well, Alisha, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your story today. And to everyone else that's tuned into another episode, thank you for your time and attention. It means more to me than you'll know, and I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.